The Galactic Concordat had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and in all that time, its leaders had never once questioned their own wisdom. They saw themselves as the architects of peace, the shepherds of lesser civilizations, and the rightful masters of a galaxy that bent to their will. 847 species called the Concordat home, and each one knew its place in the grand hierarchy that the founding races had established so long ago. The Sorenthi with their ancient wisdom, the Vraxian with their military might, the Keloth with their vast merchant fleets. These were the powers that shaped the destiny of billions. When humanity first appeared on the galactic stage, the elder races barely took notice. Here was yet another young species crawling out of their little blue world, reaching toward the stars with trembling hands and primitive ships that could barely hold together through a hyperspace jump. Ambassador Valeth of the Sorenthi Collective received the assignment to oversee humanity's integration into the Concordat, and she accepted it with the quiet resignation of someone given a tedious but necessary task. She had guided dozens of young species through their probationary periods, and she expected humans to be no different from the rest. Her first meeting with the human delegation took place aboard the diplomatic station of Arcith 9, a gleaming construct that orbited a dying star. She remembered how the humans had walked into the chamber with wide eyes, marveling at the architecture, whispering to each other about the beauty of it all. They were so eager to please that it almost embarrassed her. The lead human diplomat, a woman named Catherine Shaw, had smiled warmly and extended her hand in that strange human greeting ritual. Valeth had taken it reluctantly, noting how the human's grip was firm but not aggressive, confident but not challenging. "We are honored to be here," Catherine had said, and Valeth could detect no deception in her voice. The human genuinely meant every word. Over the following months, Valeth guided the humans through the complex web of treaties and agreements that bound the Concordat together. She explained the trade regulations, the territorial boundaries, the military protocols, and the countless unwritten rules that governed interactions between species. The humans accepted everything without complaint. When the Keloth merchant guilds demanded exclusive rights to human agricultural exports at prices far below market value, the humans agreed. When the Vraxian military command assigned human patrol ships to the most dangerous routes along the galactic rim, the humans volunteered. When the Inner Circle declared that humans would have no voting rights in the assembly for at least a century, the humans simply nodded and thanked them for the opportunity to participate at all. Valeth found it unsettling at first, but she soon convinced herself that this was simply how young species behaved. They were grateful for any scrap of acceptance, any acknowledgement that they belonged among the stars. The years passed, and humanity settled into its role at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy. Human merchant vessels carried goods for Keloth traders at a fraction of the usual rates. Human engineers built stations and repaired ships for any species that asked, often for little more than the cost of materials. Human soldiers patrolled the dangerous edges of Concordat space, facing pirates and raiders while the fleets of the elder races remained safely in the core systems. And through it all, the humans smiled and said thank you. High Arbiter Morath of the Vraxian Dominion once remarked to Valeth during a private reception that humanity was the most well-trained species the Concordat had ever absorbed. He used the word trained deliberately, as if speaking about domesticated animals rather than sentient beings. Valeth had laughed politely at the comment, as was expected of her, but something about it lingered in her mind like an unpleasant taste. She pushed the feeling aside and continued with her duties. The human delegation grew over the years as more of their people traveled to the stars. They established colonies on worlds that no other species wanted, terraforming harsh environments with a determination that bordered on obsession. They built communities in asteroid belts and on frozen moons, always expanding, always working, always grateful for whatever they were given. Admiral Yuki Tanaka arrived at the Concordat headquarters 30 years after first contact, and Valith noticed immediately that something about her was different. The Admiral was polite and respectful, just like every other human Valith had met, but there was a stillness in her eyes that suggested depths hidden beneath the surface. When Valith reviewed the Admiral's service record, she found an impressive list of accomplishments. Tanaka had led human forces against pirate fleets in the outer territories, had coordinated rescue operations during the Nexar plague outbreak, and had personally commanded the defense of a Sorenthi research station when raiders had attacked. Not once had she received official recognition from the Concordat for any of these actions. Valith mentioned this to the Admiral during a formal dinner, suggesting that perhaps humanity should submit formal requests for commendation. Tanaka had simply smiled, that same warm, patient smile that all humans seem to wear, and said that service was its own reward. "We do not help others for medals or praise," the Admiral had explained. "We help because it is right." Valith had nodded and moved on to other topics, but the conversation stayed with her. There was something in the way Tanaka had spoken, something that suggested the human knew exactly what the Concordat thought of her people and had simply chosen not to care. The other elder races saw what they wanted to see when they looked at humanity. They saw a submissive species that had accepted its place, a useful resource that asked for nothing and gave everything, a people who had been broken by the weight of galactic civilization before they had even had a chance to stand. Behind closed doors, the ambassadors and generals and merchant lords mocked humanity's eagerness. They told jokes about human simplicity and human naivety. They passed regulations that further restricted human rights without any fear of consequences. After all, what could the humans do about it? They were just one species among hundreds, and they had no real power, no real influence, no real importance in the grand scheme of things. Valith attended a meeting of the Inner Circle where High Arbiter Morath proposed reducing the already meager resources allocated to human colonies. The other members agreed without hesitation, and someone made a comment about humans being excellent at making do with less. Everyone laughed. Admiral Tanaka was present at that meeting, seated in the observation gallery where non-voting species were permitted to watch but not speak. Valith glanced up at her and saw that the Admiral's expression had not changed at all. She was still smiling, but Valith suddenly realized that the smile no longer reached her eyes. It was a mask, nothing more, and behind it was something that the ambassador could not quite identify. Later that night, Valith reviewed the patrol reports from the outer territories. She noticed that human ships had been responding to distress calls from Concordat vessels at a rate far higher than any other species. Human crews had saved thousands of lives over the past decade, often arriving at disaster sites before official rescue ships had even launched. No one had ever thanked them. Valith closed her datapad and stared out at the stars. For the first time in her long career, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. She wondered if all of them had made a terrible mistake. But the feeling passed, as such feelings always did, and she returned to her duties. Humanity was content, the Concordat was stable, and the galaxy continued to turn as it always had. Everything was fine. At least that was what she told herself. The Vorax swarm emerged from the darkness beyond the galactic rim like a plague of locusts descending upon a harvest field. No one knew where they came from or what they truly wanted, but their actions spoke louder than any words ever could. They consumed everything in their path. The first reports arrived at Concordat headquarters on a morning that Ambassador Valith would never forget. She was reviewing trade agreements when her assistant burst into her office with a look of pure terror on his face. 3 colony worlds had gone silent, and the last transmissions from each one showed the same nightmare. Millions of insected creatures pouring from ships that seemed to be grown rather than built. within a single solar cycle. The Vorax had annihilated 3 entire species: the Neth Collective, the Urathi Federation, and the pale ones of Vorinth were simply gone, their worlds reduced to stripped husks floating in the void. The Inner Circle convened emergency talks on the fortress world of Calith Prime. Every species with military capability was summoned to discuss strategy and defense, and the Great Hall filled with delegates from across the Concordat. Admiral Tanaka requested permission for the human delegation to participate in the strategy discussions. She submitted the formal request through proper channels, as humans always did, and she included detailed intelligence that human patrol ships had gathered about Vorax movement patterns. The request was denied. High Arbiter Morath explained that the Strategy Council was reserved for species with proven military traditions, and humanity had not yet demonstrated sufficient capability to contribute meaningfully to such discussions. He thanked the Admiral for her interest and suggested that humans could best serve the Concordat by continuing their patrol duties. Admiral Tanaka accepted the decision without argument. She returned to her seat in the observation gallery and watched as the elder races debated tactics and deployment strategies. Valith noticed that the Admiral's expression remained perfectly calm, but her hands were gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The ambassador felt a strange urge to speak up, to suggest that perhaps the humans deserved a voice in these proceedings, but she said nothing. The Vorax continued their advance. Within 6 months, the swarm had pushed deep into Concordat territory. 20 more worlds fell, and the refugee crisis overwhelmed every station and colony that tried to help. Billions of beings fled before the tide of destruction, and the military fleets of the elder races struggled to hold defensive lines that stretched too thin across too many sectors. Humanity offered their fleet for joint defense operations. Admiral Tanaka presented a detailed plan that would integrate human vessels with Concordat forces, creating a unified command structure that could respond more quickly to Vorax incursions. The offer was taken under consideration. The Council never voted on it. Then the Vorax struck New Kyoto, a human colony on a garden world at the edge of the outer territories. The colony had been established only 20 years earlier, and it had grown into a thriving community of 1,200,000 souls, farmers and engineers, teachers and doctors, children who had never known any home but that beautiful green world. The Vorax fleet arrived without warning. The colony's defense grid managed to destroy 2 hive ships before being overwhelmed, and the last transmission from New Kyoto showed citizens fleeing through burning streets while Vorax warriors poured from the sky. No Concordat fleet came to help. Ambassador Valith learned later that a Vraxian battle group had been stationed only 4 hours away at maximum speed. They had received New Kyoto's distress signal, had acknowledged it, and had then requested instructions from high command. The instructions never came. The Vraxian commander waited for 2 days before finally receiving orders to proceed to the colony. By then, there was nothing left but ash and silence. 1.2 million human lives, erased from existence while the Concordat debated proper protocols. The Inner Circle issued a formal statement of condolence. High Arbiter Morath expressed deep sympathy for humanity's loss and assured them that the Concordat stood with them during this difficult time. The statement was beautifully written, filled with elegant phrases about unity and shared sacrifice. It meant nothing. Valith attended the memorial service that the human delegation held aboard their flagship. She was the only non-human present, and she was not sure why she had come. Perhaps guilt, perhaps curiosity, perhaps something else entirely. Admiral Tanaka stood before a holographic display showing the names of everyone who had died. She read each name aloud, all 1,200,000 of them, and the reading took 4 days. No one left the room during those 4 days. When the last name had been spoken, the Admiral turned to face the gathered humans. Her eyes were red from exhaustion and grief, but her voice remained steady. "They will not be forgotten," she said. "None of them will ever be forgotten." Valith approached the Admiral after the service ended. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that might offer comfort, but the words refused to come. Instead, she simply stood there, feeling the weight of her own inadequacy. "You came," Admiral Tanaka said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only a tired observation. "I had to," Valith replied. "I needed you to know that not everyone in the Concordat is indifferent to your suffering." The Admiral studied her for a long moment, and Valith felt as if she were being measured and weighed. Whatever judgment the human reached, she kept it to herself. "We have submitted another request to join the Strategic Council," Tanaka said finally. "We have also offered to share intelligence that our scouts have gathered from deep reconnaissance missions inside Vorik's territory." Valith blinked in surprise. She had not known that humans were conducting such missions. "Your scouts have been operating inside Vorik's space?" she asked. "For 18 months, the Admiral confirmed. "We have mapped their hive clusters, identified their command hierarchies, and discovered weaknesses in their coordination systems. This intelligence could save millions of lives if the Council would allow us to present it." Hope flickered in Valith's chest. Surely the Inner Circle would see the value in such information. Surely they would finally recognize humanity's worth. "I will advocate for your inclusion," she promised. "I will speak to High Arbiter Moreth myself." Admiral Tanaka smiled, but it was not the warm smile that Valith had grown accustomed to. It was something colder, something that suggested the human had heard such promises before and had learned not to believe them. "Thank you, Ambassador," she said politely. "We appreciate your support." The next session of the Strategy Council opened with High Arbiter Moreth's lengthy speech about the importance of maintaining proper procedures even during times of crisis. He spoke for 2 hours about hierarchy and tradition and the wisdom of the elder races. When he finally finished, Admiral Tanaka rose from her seat in the observation gallery and requested permission to address the council. She was told to submit her request in writing and wait for a response. Valith watched the Admiral return to her seat. She watched the way the human's jaw tightened, the way her shoulders squared, the way her eyes swept across the assembled delegates of the Inner Circle. Something had changed in Admiral Tanaka's expression, and Valith suddenly felt very cold. The human was no longer smiling. For the first time since she had taken this assignment, Ambassador Valith wondered if the Concordat truly understood what it had been doing to humanity all these years. She wondered if any of them understood what happens when you push someone too far. She wondered, but she did not speak. And so the moment passed, and the council continued its deliberations, and somewhere in the observation gallery, a human admiral sat in perfect silence and watched and waited. No one noticed. No one ever noticed. The 6th session of the Caliph Accords began like every session before it. Delegates filled the great hall with their rustling robes and clicking claws and humming translators. The morning light filtered through crystalline windows that had witnessed 12,000 years of galactic history. Ambassador Valith took her usual seat among the Sorenthi delegation, her datapad loaded with reports and proposals that she knew would never be seriously considered. The Inner Circle had already decided everything behind closed doors, and these public sessions were merely theater designed to maintain the illusion of unity. High Arbiter Moreth ascended to the speaking platform with the slow dignity that his species considered appropriate for leaders of great importance. His robes trailed behind him like a river of gold, and his 4 eyes swept across the assembly with practiced authority. "Honored delegates," he began, "we gather once again to discuss our response to the Vorik's threat. Let us remember that true strength comes from unity, and unity comes from understanding our place within the natural order of things. Valith suppressed a sigh. She had heard variations of this speech 100 times before. The human delegation sat in their usual place at the back of the hall, far from the speaking platform and even farther from any position of influence. There were 12 of them today, led by Admiral Tanaka, and they wore their formal uniforms with quiet precision. High Arbiter Morath continued his speech, his voice rising and falling with practiced rhythm. He spoke of sacrifice and duty, and the burden of leadership that the elder races had carried for millennia. He spoke of the need for patience and discipline among the younger species. He spoke of everything except the millions of lives that had already been lost. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Valith noticed movement in the back of the hall. Admiral Tanaka had risen from her seat. The ambassador felt her heart skip. Humans did not interrupt. They never interrupted. And yet there stood the admiral, her posture straight and her eyes fixed on the speaking platform with an intensity that made Valith's scales prickle with sudden alarm. High Arbiter Morath noticed the standing human and paused in his speech. A murmur rippled through the assembly as delegates turned to see what was happening. Admiral Tanaka, the High Arbiter said, his voice carrying a note of irritation beneath its surface calm. "You have not been recognized to speak. Please return to your seat." The admiral did not move. "I said return to your seat," Morath repeated, and now the irritation was clearly audible. Admiral Tanaka walked forward. She did not rush, did not run, did not show any sign of aggression or anger. She simply walked down the center aisle toward the speaking platform with the steady pace of someone who had made a decision and would not be turned aside from it. 2 Vraxian guards moved to intercept her, but she stopped before they reached her and raised one hand in a gesture of peace. In her other hand, she held a small data chip. "I will speak," she said, and her voice was quiet but somehow carried to every corner of the hall. "I will speak, and you will listen because what I have to say will change everything." High Arbiter Morath stared at her with undisguised contempt. "You forget your place, human," he said. "The speaking floor is reserved for." "The Terran Republic formally withdraws from these proceedings," Admiral Tanaka announced, and her words cut through the High Arbiter's protest like a blade through silk. Silence fell upon the assembly. Valith felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. She could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but stare at the human who stood alone before 800 species and spoke the words that no one had ever expected to hear. "We withdraw from the Galactic Concordat," Tanaka continued, her voice still calm, still measured, still terrifyingly controlled. "This withdrawal is effective immediately. All treaties, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts between the Terran Republic and the Concordat are hereby nullified." Someone in the assembly made a noise that might have been a laugh. Surely this was some kind of joke. Humans did not have the authority to make such declarations. But Admiral Tanaka was not laughing. She held up the data chip so that everyone could see it. "This contains the coordinates of every Vorix hive cluster within 12 sectors," she said. "Our scouts have been mapping them for 18 months. We know their command structures, their supply lines, their breeding cycles, their weaknesses. This intelligence could turn the tide of the war." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "We were going to share this information freely. We were going to fight beside you against the swarm. We were going to die beside you, because that is what allies do." High Arbiter Morath opened his mouth to speak, but Tanaka continued before he could form words. "But you never wanted allies," she said, and now there was something in her voice that made Valith's blood run cold. Not anger, not hatred, but something worse. Disappointment. "You wanted servants. You wanted a species that would patrol your borders and build your stations and die for your causes while you laughed at us behind closed doors." She placed the data chip on the nearest table with a soft click that echoed through the silent hall. "You called us well-trained," she said. "You made jokes about our eagerness to please. You took everything we offered and gave nothing in return, not respect, not recognition, not even basic dignity." Admiral Tanaka turned to face High Arbiter Moreth directly, and their eyes met across the distance between them. "We smiled because we hoped that kindness would teach you kindness," she said. "We served because we believed that loyalty would inspire loyalty. We waited because we thought that patience would eventually be rewarded." She shook her head slowly. "We were wrong." The Admiral turned and began walking toward the exit. The 11 other members of the human delegation rose and followed her in perfect silence. "What you are about to face," Tanaka said without looking back, "you will face alone." The great doors of the assembly hall swung open before her. "Wait," someone called out. Valith realized with shock that the voice was her own. She was standing, reaching toward the departing humans with one trembling hand. Admiral Tanaka paused at the threshold. She looked back over her shoulder, and for just a moment her expression softened. "I'm sorry, Ambassador," she said quietly. "You were kind to us. I wish that could have been enough." And then the humans were gone, and the doors closed behind them, and the silence in the great hall stretched on and on and on. Valith sank back into her seat. Her hands were shaking, and she could not make them stop. She pulled up her datapad and began searching through files that she had never thought to examine carefully before. The patrol assignments. She found them and read them with new eyes. Human ships had been assigned to the most dangerous routes, yes, but humans had also volunteered for additional patrols that no one had requested. When she mapped all of their positions, she saw something that made her heart stop. The human patrol routes formed a protective ring around the entire central Concordat. They had not been serving because they were ordered to serve. They had been protecting the elder races from threats that no one else had even noticed. "High Arbiter," Valith whispered, her voice barely audible in the stunned silence of the hall. "The humans were not patrolling those routes because we assigned them." Moreth turned to look at her, with an expression of confusion and growing dread. "They volunteered," Valith continued. "They were protecting us. This whole time, they were protecting us from everything at the edges of Concordat space." The realization spread through the assembly like a wave of ice water. "And now they are gone," someone said. Ambassador Valith stared at the closed doors through which humanity had departed. For the first time in her long career, she understood what true fear felt like. The Concordat had just lost its guardian, and they had not even known they had one. The weeks that followed humanity's departure became known throughout the Concordat as the Silence. It was a name that carried more weight than anyone could have imagined when it was first spoken. At first, the elder races told themselves that nothing had really changed. Humanity was just one species among hundreds after all, and their absence would hardly be noticed. The Concordat had existed for 12,000 years before humans discovered fire, and it would continue to exist long after they were forgotten. High Arbiter Moreth gave a speech assuring the assembly that humanity's withdrawal was unfortunate but ultimately insignificant. He spoke of the strength of the elder races and the foolishness of young species who did not know their place. Many delegates nodded in agreement. Then the merchant ships stopped coming. Human trading vessels had been carrying goods between Concordat worlds for 3 decades. They charged lower rates than anyone else and took routes that other species considered too dangerous or unprofitable. No one had realized just how many supply chains depended on those humble human freighters. Within 2 weeks, 3 agricultural worlds reported food shortages. Within a month, manufacturing hubs began shutting down production lines due to lack of raw materials. By the 6th week, the economic advisors of the inner circle were using words like crisis and collapse. But the merchant ships were just the beginning. Ambassador Valith received a report from the Keloth Medical Authority that made her heart sink. Human emergency response teams had been operating quietly in 6 different sectors, providing disaster relief and medical assistance to any world that needed help. They had never asked for payment, had never demanded recognition, had simply appeared whenever there was suffering and worked to ease it. Now those teams were gone, and the Keloth Authority did not have enough personnel to replace them. A plague on the mining world of Reth 7 spread unchecked, because there was no one available to distribute medicine. A volcanic disaster on Varn Prime killed thousands who might have been saved. And still, the elder races told themselves that they did not need humanity. Then the Vorax noticed 3 hive fleets that had been mysteriously stalled at the galaxy's edge suddenly resumed their advance. They moved faster than before, more coordinated, more aggressive. It was as if some invisible barrier had been removed from their path. Valith spent sleepless nights digging through classified intelligence files, using every connection she had built over centuries of service. What she discovered filled her with a horror she could not express. Human Black Ops units had been conducting guerrilla operations inside Vorax territory for over a decade. Small teams of human soldiers had been slipping behind enemy lines, destroying supply nodes, assassinating swarm coordinators, sabotaging breeding chambers. They had been fighting a shadow war that no one in the Concordat had known about, a war that had slowed the Vorax advance by years. And now that war was over, because the soldiers had gone home. The fortress world of Galactic Prime received its first orbital bombardment 30 days after humanity's withdrawal. Vorax warships dropped from hyperspace without warning and began firing on the surface installations that had stood unconquered for 8,000 years. The Vraxian Defense Fleet responded with everything they had, and the Vorax were eventually driven back. But the damage had been done. Great towers that had witnessed the founding of the Concordat lay in ruins, and the myth of Galactic Prime's invincibility shattered like glass. High Arbiter Morath dispatched diplomatic missions to Earth, 17 of them over the following months. Each ship carried offers of renewed alliance, promises of recognition, assurances that humanity's contributions would finally be acknowledged. Each ship returned unanswered. The human border was closed. No Concordat vessel was permitted to enter Terran space, and no human ship emerged. It was as if humanity had simply vanished from the galaxy. Morath's final mission carried a personal plea from the High Arbiter himself. He had written the message in his own hand, using words that must have cost him dearly, words of regret, of admission, of desperate need. Earth's response came 3 days later. It consisted of 3 words transmitted on an open channel that every species in the Concordat could hear. You know why. Ambassador Valith was stripped of her rank shortly after the 19th diplomatic mission failed. The official reason was failure to accurately assess the human threat. But she knew the truth. Someone had to be blamed, and she had been the most visible advocate for giving humanity a chance. She did not fight the dismissal. Instead, she retreated to a small station on the edge of Sorenthi space and began compiling what she called the Tanaka Files, a comprehensive record of everything humanity had done for the Concordat. Every rescue mission, every patrol report, every emergency response. Every life saved, every threat eliminated, every disaster prevented. Every request for recognition that had been denied. Every insult spoken behind closed doors. Every death that had gone unmourned by anyone except other humans. The document grew to 10,000 pages, then 20,000, then 40,000. Valith read her own words and wept, because she finally understood the full scale of the Concordat's blindness. Humanity had given everything and asked for nothing, and the elder races had taken and taken and taken without ever once stopping to ask if perhaps they should give something back. The Vorax continued their advance. World after world fell to the swarm, and the military forces of the elder races found themselves overwhelmed at every turn. The intelligence that humanity had offered, the data chip that Admiral Tanaka had left behind, proved to be genuine, but without human scouts to update the information, it quickly became outdated. Species began breaking away from the Concordat. 83 civilizations signed separate peace treaties with the Vorax, surrendering territory and resources in exchange for promises of survival, promises that everyone knew would eventually be broken. The inner circle collapsed when the Keloth merchant guilds withdrew their support. High Arbiter Moreth retreated to his homeworld and was not heard from again. Valith watched the disintegration from her tiny station. She watched the galaxy she had spent centuries serving tear itself apart. She watched everything the Concordat had built crumble into dust. One night, when the news feeds were full of reports about another fallen world and another broken alliance, she sat down at her communication terminal and composed a message to Earth. It was not a plea for help. She had no right to ask for that. It was not a demand or a negotiation or a political maneuver. It was simply an apology. She wrote about everything she should have said and done during the years when she had been humanity's guide to the Concordat. She wrote about the times she had stayed silent when she should have spoken. She wrote about the shame she felt for being part of a civilization that had treated kindness as weakness. She did not ask for forgiveness because she knew she did not deserve it. She simply wanted humanity to know that at least one person in the galaxy understood what had been done to them. She sent the message and waited. 3 days passed with no response. On the 4th day, the station's sensors detected incoming vessels, dozens of them at first, then hundreds, then thousands. Valith watched the scanner readings with tired resignation, certain that the Vorax had finally come for her. She prepared herself for the end. But when the ships emerged from hyperspace, they were not Vorax warships. They were human. Ambassador Valith stared at her screen in disbelief as the largest fleet she had ever seen arranged itself in perfect formation around her tiny station. At the head of that fleet flew a dreadnought of impossible scale, a ship that dwarfed anything the Concordat had ever built. Its name was emblazoned across the hull in letters a kilometer tall. The TRS Yuki Tanaka. Valith's communication terminal flickered to life, and a familiar face appeared on the screen, older now, more tired, but still possessing that quiet strength that had always unsettled the ambassador without her understanding why. Ambassador Valith, Admiral Tanaka said, "We received your message." Valith opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She could only stare at the human who had every reason to let the galaxy burn. "I need to explain something," the Admiral continued. "We did not come back because you apologized. We did not come back because the Concordat finally admitted its mistakes. We did not come back because anyone asked us to." Her expression hardened. "We came back because we refused to become what you made us feel." The fleet began to move, passing the station on their way toward Vorax space. Admiral Tanaka smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes. "Humanity does not abandon people to die," she said, "even when they deserve it." The transmission ended, and Valith watched the human fleet disappear into the darkness between the stars. For the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The human fleet moved through Concordat space like a storm of righteous fury. Everywhere they went, the Vorax fell before them. Every hive ship that rose to challenge them was reduced to drifting wreckage within hours. Ambassador Valith traveled with the fleet aboard a medical vessel, offering what help she could to the wounded and displaced. She watched the human soldiers fight and bleed and die for species that had mocked them, and she marveled at their capacity to care for those who had given them so little reason to care. The first major engagement took place above the colony world of Sethar 3. A Vorax fleet of 200 ships had surrounded the planet and was preparing to begin its harvest when the human dreadnought dropped out of hyperspace directly in their midst. The TRS Yuki Tanaka was a monster of engineering, bristling with weapons that no other species had ever seen. It fired once, and 30 Vorax ships ceased to exist. It fired again, and 30 more followed them into oblivion. The rest of the human fleet swept in from every direction, coordinating with a precision that took Valith's breath away. Human pilots flew their fighters into the hearts of hive ships and detonated their reactors from within. Human marines boarded Vorax command vessels and fought their way to the central brains that coordinated swarm behavior. Within 6 hours, the entire Vorax fleet had been destroyed. The people of Sethar 3 emerged from their shelters to find human dropships landing in their ruined cities. Soldiers who should have been celebrating their victory were instead unloading medical supplies and emergency rations. Engineers were already surveying damaged infrastructure and making plans for reconstruction. An elderly Keloth woman approached a human medic who was treating survivors of a collapsed building. She looked at the young soldier with confusion in her eyes. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "We did nothing to help you." The medic smiled gently as she bandaged the woman's wounds. "That's not why we help people," she said. "We help because we can." The Burning Week, as it came to be called, saw the human fleet strike at 7 major Vorax hive clusters simultaneously. Admiral Tanaka had spent the year of silence preparing for exactly this kind of campaign, coordinating with human intelligence networks that had been operating in Vorax space since before the withdrawal. Every strike was surgical, devastating, and perfectly timed. On the 3rd day, human forces destroyed the primary breeding complex that produced Vorax queens. Without new queens to coordinate their swarms, entire hive fleets fell into chaos and began fighting each other. On the 5th day, human hackers infiltrated the neural network that connected all Vorax minds and introduced a corruption that spread like wildfire. Billions of swarm warriors simply stopped moving as their shared consciousness tore itself apart. On the 7th day, Admiral Tanaka led a strike force directly into the heart of Vorax territory and destroyed the central intelligence, a massive organic computer the size of a small moon that had guided the swarm's expansion for centuries. The Vorax did not surrender because they did not have the capacity for surrender. They simply ceased to function as a unified threat. Scattered hive fleets continued to cause problems for years afterward, but the existential danger had passed. The galaxy had been saved by the species it had despised. In the aftermath of the Burning Week, survivors from across the Concordat gathered on Calith Prime to witness something that had never happened before, a human addressing the Galactic Assembly as an equal. Admiral Tanaka stood on the speaking platform where High Arbiter Moreth had once lectured her about knowing her place. She looked out at the delegates who remained, less than half of the original number, with empty seats marking the species that had been lost, and she spoke without notes or prepared remarks. "We came back because humanity does not abandon people to die," she began. "We came back because watching the galaxy burn would have made us into something we refused to become." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer but no less powerful. "We did not come back for gratitude or rewards or recognition. We did not come back to prove that we were right and you were wrong. We did not come back to gloat over your suffering or demand that you acknowledge your mistakes." The Admiral's gaze swept across the assembly. "We came back because being kind is not a transaction. It is not something we do in exchange for being treated well. It is simply who we are." She straightened her shoulders. "You may rebuild your coalition. You may establish new treaties and new alliances. You may even invite humanity to join as a member, and if you do, we will consider your offer seriously and fairly." Her expression hardened just slightly. "But understand this. We are not your servants. We are not your soldiers. We are not your children waiting to be taught our place in your hierarchy." Admiral Tanaka took a step forward, and her voice rang through the hall like a bell. "We are humanity. We are kind because we choose to be kind. We are strong because kindness is not weakness. And the next time anyone in this galaxy forgets what that means—" She let the words hang in the air. "There will not be a next time." The Admiral turned and walked toward the exit, just as she had done 1 year earlier. But this time, no one tried to stop her, and no one looked at her with contempt. Instead, they looked at her with something she had never seen from the elder races before: respect. Ambassador Valith watched Admiral Tanaka depart. She wanted to follow, to speak with the human one more time, but she knew that some words were better left unspoken. Instead, she turned to the delegates around her and began to speak. "We have been given a second chance," she said. "We did not earn it, we did not deserve it, but we have been given it nonetheless." She looked at the empty seats, the memorials to fallen species, the scars that war had left on everything and everyone. "The humans taught us something that we should have known all along," she continued. "They taught us that kindness is not weakness. They taught us that helping others is not a sign of submission. They taught us that true strength lies in choosing to be gentle when you have every reason to be harsh." Valith felt tears forming in her eyes, but she did not try to hide them. "We looked at humanity and saw servants because we could not imagine anyone being kind without wanting something in return. We saw weakness because we had forgotten what real strength looked like. We saw a species that needed to be taught its place, when in truth, we were the ones who had lost our way." She took a deep breath. "If we rebuild the Concordat, if we create something new from the ashes of what we destroyed, let us remember this lesson. Let us remember that the species we dismissed as broken was the only one willing to save us. Let us remember that they did it not because we earned their help, but because helping is simply what humans do." The assembly sat in silence for a long moment. Then slowly, delegates began to stand. One by one, they rose from their seats, Sorenthi and Vraxian and Keloth and dozens of other species, and they turned toward the doors through which Admiral Tanaka had departed. They did not speak, they did not need to. They simply stood in honor of the species that had refused to let them die. Ambassador Valith stood with them, and in that moment she made a promise to herself. She would spend the rest of her life making sure that no one ever forgot what humanity had done, not the battles they had won, but the choice they had made. The choice to be kind, even when kindness had been denied to them. The choice to save those who had hurt them. The choice to show the galaxy that mercy and strength could exist in the same heart. Outside, the human fleet was preparing to depart. Their work was done, and they were going home. But they would be back. Not as servants or soldiers or children seeking approval. They would return as equals, as partners, as the species that had taught the galaxy the most important lesson it had ever learned. Kindness is not weakness. And those who mistake one for the other rarely survive the lesson.